Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our program tonight. My name is Jessica Rockhold, and I'm the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. And it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. We are in a Zoom webinar format, and we encourage you as the evening progresses to put your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the evening, we'll be joined by Dr. Shelley Klein, who will come on and moderate questions to our presenter, Dr. Melissa Karp. Tonight's program is unique on multiple levels. Tonight, you are going to experience the telling of a story that elevates Jewish resistance, and it asks us to consider the ways in which that resistance is manifested, the many different ways it can be manifested, and how it can be sustained. It spotlights the unique experience of an individual, Claude Cahun, who was both Jewish and a member of the LGBT community. It recognizes the German occupation of a geography that almost never gets spoken about. We're usually unfamiliar with the story of the Channel Islands and the German occupation of that space that started in the summer of 1940 and didn't end until a day after the war ended in Europe. And all of this is transmitted to us in an unusual form of a graphic novel, which is uniquely accessible and especially interesting in the telling of a story of an artist. This kind of a story is coming to you because of a very special relationship that we now have at MCHE with the newest member of our team, Dr. Melissa Karp. It's my pleasure to introduce you to her today. Melissa joined our team in August as our new content specialist, having just completed her PhD in literature at Duke University, where her research focused on World War II collaborators in memory media across both Europe and East Asia. And in particular, in the European sphere, she focuses very heavily on the French experience. The material that she's going to share tonight was part of a job talk that she gave as part of her interview process, a process that I have to add just highlighted her considerable skills as an educator. Aside from her extreme command of this history and the empathy that she comes to this history with, just a gifted educator. So I'm sure you can tell how excited we are to have Melissa with us at MCHE. And I'm so pleased to welcome all of you to hear what is her first of hopefully very many excellent presentations at MCHE. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that really kind introduction. Hello, everyone. I am also very, very excited to be joining the team at MCHE. It's been an exciting couple months, and I am looking forward as well to many future programs. But I'm particularly excited about tonight's program. I will go ahead and share my screen to get it started. All right. Okay. So tonight I am going to be talking about Claude Cahun and their incredible story. Cahun is an incredible example of someone who resisted the Nazis at great personal risk. As a queer, Jewish, anti-fascist artist, Cahun could have been quadruply marked for extermination under Nazi rhetoric, but instead they chose to resist. Cahun's story presents a unique opportunity, as Jessica said, to learn about several sometimes less discussed parts of the Holocaust experience, including a story of LGBT people living under Nazi rule, the role of artwork in political resistance, and the unfolding of the Holocaust on the Channel Islands and in France. This presentation will follow Cahun and their creative and romantic partner, Marcel Moore, alongside these other histories. So before I get started, I just want to briefly thank some other scholars who have been putting out really incredible work on Cahun and Moore. I want to firstly thank M. Farr, who wrote their thesis on Cahun and generously shared their story with me. And I would also like to shout out scholarship from Jennifer Shaw, Tirza True-Latimer, Jeffrey Jackson, and Kaz Rowe, whose work has been very helpful as I put this program together. So Kaz Rowe in particular produced this incredible graphic novel biography, which recounts Cahun and Moore's lives and their profound history of resistance. It's a featured source in our recent MCHE newsletter, and its publication reflects an uptick of interest in Cahun and Moore's lives. You can see the cover here on the left and the photo that it represents on the right. Throughout the graphic novel, Rowe intermingles the real writings and photographs of these artists with their own beautiful illustrations, and they tell a personal, moving, and inspiring story that feels very, very relevant today. So you'll see some panels or pages from their book throughout the presentation that help me showcase some of the key moments in Cahun and Moore's story. And I also very much recommend checking out this graphic novel after the presentation. So I want to start by addressing the way that I talk about Claude Cahun. You may notice that I refer to Cahun using they, them pronouns, which would not have been in use during their lifetime in the same way. It can be difficult to translate queer identities and experiences across time, since a community's conception of gender and sexuality, how it's defined, and what norms it's defined against are constantly in flux. It's also deeply personal. And this is not only true of LGBT identity, but also categories like racial or ethnic identity that are shaped by the cultural environment and moment of history that they're in. I choose to refer to Cahun using they, them pronouns, following other trans scholars' advice, because Cahun themselves wrote about wanting to find gender-neutral language in their own lifetime. You can see the quote here: "Shuffle the cards, masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me." The French language is very heavily gendered. Even objects and places always have a gender. So Cahun expressing frustration with needing to fit a particular box in their self-description feels very important. I also want to hold their story open to a variety of people who may identify with different parts of their legacy through either queer, lesbian, transgender, or gender nonconforming identity. But it is also true that for cases like Cahun's, there's no one right answer, and other scholars refer to them using different pronouns. So I'll give you a very brief overview of Cahun's life before I get more into the story. Claude Cahun, photographed here on the left, was born Lucy Schwab on October 25th, 1894. They grew up in Nantes, in France, at the turn of the 20th century. Their father was part of a prominent Jewish family of writers and intellectuals, and Cahun grew up surrounded by artwork and books. As a teenager, Cahun met their future partner, Suzanne Malherbe, pictured here on the right. Though they had been introduced as children, they were both from Nantes, they both later called this particular meeting a strike of lightning. The two fell in love and began to work together on illustrated books and photography when they moved to Paris. They joined the radical surrealist art movement, producing artwork that questioned reality, norms of society and power, and current political systems. Cahun began questioning their gender and ultimately described themselves as neutral, taking on the name Claude Cahun in their work. Malherbe took the name Marcel Moore, and so I'll be referring to them by those names. Cahun's childhood also gives us a lens to understand Jewish life and anti-Semitism already present in France long before 1940. So in 1871, a bit before Cahun was born, following France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the easternmost region of France, Alsace-Lorraine, was added back to Germany, was annexed back to Germany. And you can see it on the map here, this little red sliver. Alsace-Lorraine had been annexed to France originally in 1648 and had added its historically significant Jewish population to France at that time. After it was reclaimed by Germany, many Alsatians remained or moved to France, and this influx, combined with Germanophobia following the war, created suspicion around Alsatians and Alsatian Jews. Ironically, Alsatian Jews at this time were thought of by the French as too German to be loyal. This wave of anti-Semitism culminated in a legal scandal known in France as the Dreyfus Affair, named for this man photographed here, Alfred Dreyfus. This scandal took place from 1894 to 1906, during which time Dreyfus, who was a French army officer and was an Alsatian Jew, was accused and wrongfully convicted of treachery. He was later exonerated in 1906, and the scandal occupied much public media attention in the years in between. It was considered the most significant event in the modern political history of anti-Semitism in France until the Second World War. And you can see here one of the famous anti-Semitic propaganda posters depicting Dreyfus that was circulated at the time. Personally, for Cahun, their father was a newspaper owner in Nantes, and their paper publicly supported Dreyfus throughout the affair, and his exoneration. The newspaper was protested as a result, and Cahun saw these effects up close. Cahun's non-Jewish mother also harbored her own resentments against Cahun. She tormented them about their nose and ears, which she derided as being ugly, and in her words, not Greek. This was coded anti-Semitic language at the time that linked pure French lineage to the ancient Greeks and their historic profile. Cahun's mother also struggled with mental illness and was institutionalized during Cahun's youth before she passed away, but she left this strong impact. In their mother's absence, Cahun was mostly raised by their paternal grandmother, Mathilde. Mathilde taught Cahun about their family's Jewish and intellectual history, fostering their love of reading and writing. It is likely that Mathilde is the one who made the link between these two family heritages for Cahun and countered the anti-Semitism of their mother. But they experienced this hatred outside of the house as well. Cahun recalled an incident where classmates at school tied them to a tree and pelted them with rocks. You can also see here Rose's depiction of a young Cahun walking past the same anti-Dreyfus propaganda from the last slide. It was clear that this era of anti-Semitism in France and at home had a profound effect on Cahun's development. After the bullying incident, Cahun was sent to school in Surrey, in England. The 1890s was not only a moment of heightened anti-Semitism, but also of heightened homophobia in Europe. Cahun's uncle, Marcel Schwab, pictured on the left, was also a writer and was friendly with Oscar Wilde and Alfred Douglas, who were at the center of a series of trials that drew celebrity attention to Wilde's sexual relationships with men before he was convicted of indecency. Schwab had helped Wilde translate his play Salome into French. As such, Cahun would have read these works and known about the trials, which had a temporary chilling effect on the inclusion of LGBT themes in literature, even subtly. In fact, Cahun earlier used the pen name Daniel Douglas as a reference to Alfred before settling on Claude Cahun, so they would have been aware of this history. It was Cahun's father who was at first not very supportive of their relationship with Moore, but later, after Cahun developed an addiction to ether and became very ill, he acquiesced to let them stay together and let Moore care for Cahun. In 1919, Cahun's widowed father and Moore's widowed mother actually married, making the two appear as stepsisters. They now had a socially acceptable cover for living together in Paris, where they moved in 1920. Interwar Paris has gained a reputation as a haven for subversive artists around the world. And it was during this time that artists and writers, both French and international, including Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, Jean Cocteau, André Breton, Henri Michaud, Salvador Dali, Marc Chagall, René Magritte, and many, many others, produced some of the most prolific and influential work of the 20th century. Some of these individuals, like Breton and Michaud, became friends of Cahun and Moore. Breton once called Cahun one of the most curious spirits of our time. Cahun and Moore hosted salons at their apartment where these creatives could discuss art and politics together. And they also joined Contre-Attaque, a union of communist writers, artists, and workers in Paris. Additionally, in interwar Paris, a new conception of queerness was arising that started to think about queer identity as something someone is rather than something that they do. This became possible alongside the growth of a large queer community in Paris, where groups could find each other and created their own collective spaces against the backdrop of this incredible explosion of art and literature. Gertrude Stein and her partner Alice B. Toklas hosted lesbian salons that might have inspired Cahun and Moore, and Sylvia Beach ran the original Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris in the 6th arrondissement. Beach sold banned, censored texts and published controversial writings that other presses wouldn't take, like James Joyce's Ulysses. Montmartre and Montparnasse became havens for lesbian bars like the Monocle, photographed here. And LGBT life in Paris benefited from France having decriminalized homosexuality following the revolution in 1791, so a long time before. Though certain decency laws and cultural oppression still made this community targets. In 1920s France, a new discipline called sexology was also gaining traction. A flawed field that often continued to pathologize queer people, it nevertheless created space for new theorizations of sexuality and sexual identity that spurred on discussions about gender within and outside these communities. There was much variation in what sexologists thought about gender and same-sex attraction at the time, and some of it appealed very greatly to Cahun. At this time, the way people thought about gender and sexuality was very different in that these definitions were much more entangled than the way we might think about them today. These studies also opened space for queer people to begin to think about existing in community with each other in new ways. Cahun and Moore were interested in sexology's potential and even translated some major texts into French from Havelock Ellis. Their association with sexology books is notable, of course, because such texts were targeted in the Nazis' book burnings in Berlin in 1933, after the looting of Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science. Around this time, when Cahun took their new name, they borrowed the identifiably Jewish surname Cahun from their grandmother's family. It's related to Cohn, and often is pronounced by English scholars as Cahun. They also cut their hair and began experimenting with their appearance, playing with the boundaries of gender presentation being debated around Paris. Bro's page on the left here shows the ways that Cahun might have linked their nonconformist ideas about gender with their heritage as a Jewish intellectual through their name. Both opened up space for them to think differently. Combined with this kind of avant-garde collages they produced, as you can see here on the right, Cahun began to think about the way people's appearances and their inner worlds could be misaligned. They became fascinated with the idea of the masks that we all wear in different spaces and viewed every different facet of the self as a performance. They started taking photos of themselves in masks and incorporating disembodied limbs and eyes into their work, as you can see in this collage. Every individual piece of a person could be severed and reassembled into someone new. For Cahun, this freedom was thrilling. And more importantly, it was this kind of self-probing work that might allow one to truly know themselves. In their 1930s works, Cahun articulated two philosophies that would set the scene for their larger ideas about resistance during the war. In the book Cahun and Moore co-produced in 1930, Aveu non avenu, or Disavowal, they constantly rejected an idea they saw taking hold in conservative political and artistic circles of cultural idealization. Jennifer Shaw describes it as a process in which, quote, idiosyncratic, individual, and imperfect characteristics are removed, and ideal ones created, emphasized, and fixed according to dominant values, unquote. Cahun and Moore saw cultural idealization as a form of massive repression, which subjugated who individuals could be in their artistic expression, but also in their psychology, their social interactions, and ultimately their sexual and romantic lives. In 1934, Cahun's work, Le Paris sont ouverts, or Place Your Bets, explained Cahun's idea of indirect action, that art that was heavy-handed in its politics would not have any kind of revolutionary effect on its audience, since it required artists to be able to predict exactly how someone would view their work and how they would react to it. In surrealist understandings of art, which take up the idea that everyone is viewing things through the lens of an unconscious self they might not understand, the idea that art could produce one reliable meaning did not really hold up. Instead, Cahun suggested that works like surrealist poetry, stories, or photographs that did not declare their political messages overtly would have a much deeper psychological effect. They proposed that any interaction with that kind of art would provoke people to view the world differently and to question their own perspectives. As Jeffrey Jackson suggests, it would, quote, provoke them to think, unquote. That critical thinking training was more valuable than forcing any particular perspective to Cahun. It would also imbue individuals with the dignity of their own conclusions and empower them to say no when they encountered injustice. At the same time as this wave of experimental art, politics, and gender expression was sweeping Paris, conservative movements were also growing in France. A reactionary movement started in the 1920s as an attempt to return France to more traditional values, known as the Return to Order. This meant that women who had gone to work and gained autonomy during World War I were to return home to domestic roles. And keep in mind that French women did not gain the right to vote until after World War II, so they were not formally a part of making these political decisions about their role. Additionally, fashion was to revert to traditional gender norms, and artwork was to return to classical forms and Greek ideals of feminine beauty depicted in sculptures such as the Venus de Milo, displayed in the Louvre. These movements stood in opposition to avant-garde experimental forms like surrealism that challenged traditional ideas of beauty. In this provocative photo montage, which appears in Disavowals, Cahun seems to mock the return to order. Their pose in doubled profile beside classic Greek sculptures emphasizes both their gender neutrality when positioned against this ideal European woman and the nose that their mother detested for its supposed Jewishness. This neutral, multiple, and Jewish Cahun is a playful way of satirizing these cultural norms and also shows that Cahun refuses to hide or feel ashamed of who they are and how they present themselves. At the same time, in this lead up to World War II, the size and visibility of the Jewish community in France is bolstered by refugees and immigrants leaving Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union, and also later the Netherlands and Belgium to escape Nazism. The Jewish population reached around 330,000 by 1940, which was still less than 1% of the total population, but a significant number. The Jewish population was often in tension with itself during this time. These new Jewish communities clashed with longstanding and much more assimilated French Jewish communities that had been there in some cases for thousands of years. In reaction, anti-Semitism began to rise again among the general French population in the 1930s, bolstered by these French conservative factions, as well as the rise of a far-right ultranationalist press, increasingly sympathetic to xenophobia and anti-Semitic rhetorics of fascism. This rising anti-Semitism reminded Cahun of their childhood fears. This is exemplified in Rowe's depiction of this nightmarish Eiffel Tower lording its Frenchness over Cahun's head. As Rowe describes it here as Cahun, quote, "The shadows of hate loomed, threatening to swallow me." In the 1930s, there were also a number of major political tensions and outright clashes between the left and the right that took place in Paris. France was hit by the Great Depression and its after effects in 1931. They amplified social, political, and economic unrest in an already stressed situation following the recovery after World War I. One important event is known as the Stavisky Affair and regards Alexandre Stavisky, a Jewish Ukrainian naturalized French citizen who was indicted for embezzlement and fraud scams that he had run in France throughout the interwar years. His trial was delayed several times before he was found dead in January 1934. Stavisky was seen as having been protected by the left-wing government due to associations with some of the ministers at the time. In much media coverage, his unsavory financial reputation, as well as his Ukrainian and Jewish origins, and his appearance were linked into various anti-Semitic stereotypes pushed by the right wing. His story would later be featured in a French Nazi propaganda film aired in 1942. So on February 6, 1934, following the scandal and several others, Prime Minister Camille Chaudhon resigned, and Edouard Daladier of the same party takes over. Daladier also fired the right-leaning police prefect in Paris, who was accused of giving the right-wing preferential treatment. And this change was met by widespread protests and agitation from the French far right. These were led by young members of the Action Française, a far-right nationalist group that later supported the collaborationist government. Students and demonstrators clashed in the streets, and police opened fire on armed rioters, killing 17 demonstrators, mostly members of the Action Française. Many more were injured. These events further unsettled the French political scene, and they were used as a rallying cry among the right wing as they grew more sympathetic to fascism from abroad and also leaned into ultranationalist propaganda. At the same time, Cahun and Moore joined with several anti-fascist organizations, including the Association for Revolutionary Writers and Artists, which organized against German fascism and French imperialism, and the Vigilance Committee of Anti-Fascist Intellectuals. The latter came into being as a response to the February 6 crisis, and it was an attempt to bring the left together to oppose a dangerous rise in violent repressive rhetoric now coming from the far right. The organization ultimately broke down over disagreements related to the appeasement of Hitler. So fearing the rise in fascism and feeling increasingly alienated from many of the men in their anti-fascist movements, Cahun and Moore decided to move to Jersey, one of the British Channel Islands, in 1937. It's marked by this very tiny circle on the map. I will pull up a larger map in a minute, but just to give you a sense of where it's located in Europe. Cahun and Moore had vacationed in Jersey before, and so they were familiar with the island. They also inherited a significant sum of money from their families as both of their parents passed away, and this was enough to purchase a home there. They first spent time in Saint-Hélier before finding La Roquaise, a seaside manor in Saint-Prélade. The pair were extremely productive artists during this time, and they left behind a series of iconic photographs. Though they returned to their names Lucy and Suzanne and moderated their appearances during this time, the photographs continued their questioning of gender. And, of course, many photo shoots included their cat, Kid, who they smuggled to Jersey in an Hermes bag. They even walked Kid and their other cat, Nike, on a leash around the island. And you can also see Cahun wearing one of their masks in this photo. The Channel Islands, and here's the larger map that I promised. The Channel Islands are made up of Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, Sark, and some other smaller islands. They have a unique history and tradition of their own at an intersection between Franco-Norman and British cultures. As a result, they possess their own dialects, though most islanders spoke English and French. Though the islands were part of Great Britain at this time, they are geographically closer to France, and so had a diverse population drawing from these two nations as well as others. They were also a popular vacation spot. But despite the reprieve Cahun and Moore found in Jersey, the war continued to get closer. So when Germany invaded France in May 1940, the Jewish community in France was already extremely diverse in terms of religious practice, history, politics, and ethnicity. As I've said, newer immigrants and older populations sometimes clashed with one another. And during the war, newer immigrants were more universally targeted by the persecution that would follow. But these older Jewish communities, many of which prided themselves on their total assimilation into French society, like Cahun's family, were also targeted. It's important to understand that no level of assimilation or lack thereof saved these communities from the coming Holocaust. Nor did it save the small Jewish population on the Channel Islands. The total island's population during the war did not exceed about 66,000, though a quarter of the population had already evacuated prior to the occupation. Though an exact number of the total Jewish population on the islands is not precisely known, it is estimated that only about 30 Jewish people remained on the islands while they were occupied. They were nonetheless targeted for genocide. So the Nazis invaded France on May 10th, 1940. By June 25th, France surrendered to Germany, and the Allies evacuated mainland Europe entirely. The defeat was swift and completely surprising, as the Germans did not attack as expected and were able to surround Paris from all sides. You can see this iconic photograph of them marching under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. So why did France surrender so quickly? After this demoralizing military defeat, and with the memory of World War I, in which much of the country was destroyed, still painfully strong among French leaders, the surrender was deemed the best way to protect the people, though of course, not all people living in France were considered. Those making the decisions would prove themselves to be largely in sympathy with the Nazi project. Shortly afterwards, the Nazis attacked the unguarded Channel Islands. Though the islands were part of Great Britain, the British had chosen to withdraw all defenses after the Allied defeat on the continent in hopes that the demilitarized islands would be spared a direct German assault. They were not. The British did not inform the Germans of their withdrawal until June 30th, and at that point, the Germans had already proceeded bombing the island ports and occupied the islands. 25% of islanders, including most of the children that lived there, had already been evacuated prior to the invasion. But Moore and Cahun, and many others, decided to stay. Later, they would write that they made the choice already hoping to find greater opportunities to resist there than they would in England. They described anger at the passive attitudes of many of their neighbors toward the occupation, at least at the beginning. Many islanders took to referring to the Nazis as visitors and hoped the occupation would pass quickly. Cahun and Moore seemed not to have the same illusions. So following France's surrender, France was first divided into an occupied zone, that red zone at the top, which was occupied and administered by the Nazis, and a so-called free zone, that purple zone at the bottom, that was governed by the collaborationist French government known as the Vichy government. There's also a region of eastern France, including Alsace, that was fully annexed to Germany. You can see it's a darker red. And a region in the north of France that was annexed to German-occupied Belgium. A small part of southern France was also occupied by the Italians, and they generally enforced fewer deportation policies than these other regions. But over the course of the next 4 years, the Nazi zone increased in size, and the regional experiences of occupation varied under these different groups and different time periods. But regardless, there was no safe place in France. The Channel Islands, and you can see them here in that little circle at the top, were administered as part of the occupied zone under the Nazi military administration and occupied with soldiers for the entirety of the war. You can see on the Atlantic coast of France this dark red line that runs right up against the Channel Islands. That line was Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall was a massive defensive effort to fortify the continent from British or American invasions through the Atlantic. The Nazis quickly decided that the Channel Islands were a strategic possession as part of the Atlantic Wall. This meant that 12,000 soldiers were at a time stationed in Guernsey alone, a ratio of about 2 soldiers to every islander. Forts, tunnels, anti-aircraft defenses, and artillery reshaped the islands. And these 2 photos at the top of the slide are actually contemporary photos of some of the remnants of the Atlantic Wall that are still well preserved on these islands. Hitler expressed direct interest in the fortification of the islands starting in 1941, and he decreed that 1/12 of all steel and concrete allocated for the Atlantic Wall should go directly to the islands. It has been said that the Channel Islands were at one point the most fortified place in the world during this buildup of defenses. You can see some older photos at the bottom of the construction process, and I'll talk more about who was involved in that process in a moment. Despite this great investment of resources, the invasion they prepared for never came to the islands. In fact, they were easily bypassed to get directly to the continent on D-Day. So let's talk a little bit about Vichy France and what that looked like before we move on. So shortly after the surrender, French Parliament voted extra legally to draw up a new constitution and imbue the Prime Minister with emergency powers as the exclusive head of state, dissolving the Third Republic, which had governed France since 1870. After a recent resignation, the man in line was Philippe Pétain, a World War I military hero who held much respect in France, particularly among older generations. You can see him shaking Hitler's hand in the photo. He's the one with the white mustache. Pétain governed France as an authoritarian state, which quickly took on his conservative, reactionary political character. These changes meant that Pétain and his cabinet could immediately implement any policies they wanted across the unoccupied zone, as long as the Nazis didn't object, and they set about pursuing anti-Semitic policy almost immediately. After the war, many would argue that the Vichy government had simply been going along with the Nazi plan or trying to appease them, but it is clear from the paper trail that many in the Vichy government took their own initiative to target Jews and others. Though they certainly wouldn't have bought into the idea that Germans were a superior race, they were on board with their assertions that Jews and other perceived enemies of the conservative movement were inferior. Accordingly, Vichy also led widespread cultural propaganda campaigns, sometimes in correspondence with Nazi propaganda, and sometimes independently. Pétain quickly replaced the famous French motto, liberty, equality, fraternity, with his new slogan, work, family, fatherland, echoing the fascist nationalist overtones of the Nazis and coinciding with conservative views of gender roles, motherhood, and femininity from the return to order. Though Vichy did not recriminalize homosexuality in France in this policing of gender roles, its officers and collaborators continued to target some LGBT people throughout the occupation. The lesbian bars and bookstores that had populated Cahun and More's World in Paris also shut down. And you can see in this propaganda poster here on the left, the new Pétainist slogan of France under the house labeled France that is now standing upright and strong. The house of the Third Republic that has been toppled. You can see it under the shadow of a Star of David, and it's sitting on top of bricks that list a variety of these different groups that were targeted both by the Nazis and by Vichy. So within the first month of Vichy's empowerment, the Ministry of Justice began to retroactively strip Jews and others naturalized in the past 15 years of French citizenship. Within the remaining 6 months of 1940 alone, Germans required Jews in the occupied zone to paint the word Juif on their businesses, and in Vichy France, special laws were passed excluding Jews from the military, media, civil service, and other economic activities. These laws applied across the occupied zone as well, as they aligned with Nazi Aryanization efforts. Soon after, French citizenship that had been granted to Algerian Jews and their descendants in 1870 was also universally revoked. And at the time, that Jewish population in Algeria and North Africa rivaled the entire Jewish population in France. So it drastically changed the numbers, even though most of them didn't live in the European continent. French Jews were also made to wear the yellow star, and throughout France had their income, businesses, and radios confiscated, and in many cases were confined to their homes. Synagogues were attacked and burned throughout France. And so in these photos, you can see the yellow star and some women wearing it in the picture below. The picture on the right shows a Jewish business that's been victimized. And on the left is another propaganda exhibit called The Jew and France, which tries to continue to forward this Vichy and Nazi message that Jews were responsible for the downfall of the Third Republic. Things became more dire when the government began interning these so-called foreign Jews, even though this included those who had been citizens up until just recently, and when they had their citizenship revoked. Starting in October 1940, these Jews were interned in a series of transit camps throughout the Free Zone. The Vichy government took much of their own initiative to implement these laws and round up and deport Jewish citizens to concentration camps. In fact, it was Vichy officials who first requested that Jewish children under the age of 16 be included in deportation lists. Many of the roundups occurred under direct order from Pétain, even in the occupied zone in Paris, where the community was largest. The Nazis, of course, did not intervene to stop these attacks. Why would they? They were in line with their policy. The biggest of these roundups, photographed here, was called Veldiv, named for the area where people were imprisoned. During Veldiv, nearly 20,000 Jewish people, including 5,000 children, were rounded up and put in detention over the course of just 2 days to be prepared for deportation. So this is what Cahun and More avoided by moving to the islands, but much of the same troubles followed. Early on, the Nazis took total control of the islands. One of their first orders was changing the direction of traffic from the British style of driving on the left to match the continental European rule of driving on the right. They also took over the postal service, and you can see here the way that they hastily changed British stamps to reflect that Jersey and the other islands were occupied. These may seem like small details, but they illustrated a version of total control that the Nazis were trying to implement on the islands. Additionally, 9 anti-Semitic regulations were implemented in Jersey and Guernsey between October 1940 and August 1942. In the first order, the Nazis required Jews on the island to register. They also required German speakers to register. The other orders that followed required Jews to declare any economic activity they were involved in, and also required their spouses to declare the same even if they weren't Jewish, required the Aryanization of Jewish businesses, the implementation of a curfew for Jewish residents, and a prohibition on them moving house without permission. These orders also banned Jews from places of entertainment, such as theaters, and they restricted shopping hours for Jews to only particular times. Additionally, there was a requirement for Jews to wear a yellow star, but this one in particular was not really enforced on the islands. we only have some stories of Jewish laborers imprisoned in camps who wore the yellow star in those camps, and I will get to the labor camps in a minute. It may seem surprising that the Germans even bothered to put these orders into place for such a small Jewish population. Remember, we're talking about maybe 30 people. But the genocidal ideology of the Nazis held that all Jews were a danger and that all must be targeted. In order to make this true, they had to go after populations just as small as this one in order to perpetuate that logic. Cahun was Jewish, as we've discussed, though they weren't religious, that didn't really matter in Nazi definitions, and Moore was a German speaker, but neither registered. They were not caught in this lie, which meant that the next time the Nazis tried to restrict a right, in 1942, the right to own a radio, they turned theirs in while secretly buying another radio. Their access to the radio and to BBC broadcasts throughout the war would become crucial to their anti-Nazi efforts. Similarly, when asked to turn in their typewriters, they made sure to hide one away. Cahun and Moore did not yet know exactly how they would embark on this powerful project of artistic resistance, but they knew from living a life of stepping outside of bounds, taking risks, and holding on to their self-expression and autonomy that they could not give in to these repressions just because they were ordered to. Of course, they also had other advantages not necessarily available to everyone under occupation that made some of these initial refusals easier. They were not outed as lesbians, as Jews, or as communists by those around them. They also came to the island with money and possessed a large home, giving them the means to insulate themselves from more dire circumstances. Their money and social class had often protected them and given them a leg up, even in Paris. When the Nazis later declared they would be taking up residence in some of the rooms of Les Roquets, the space was big enough that Cahun and Moore could stay somewhat apart and even continue some of their resistance activities. Had they been poorer, one could imagine that their luck would have run out much sooner. Still, many wealthy people did not resist, not on the islands nor in France. Not even the entirety of the radical lesbian community in Paris objected to Vichy. Gertrude Stein, for example, also Jewish and queer, translated Pétain's speeches into English for a friend. This collaboration kept her and Toklas protected, as well as their artwork. Cahun and Moore, on the other hand, chose to risk everything they had, and they had a lot to lose, to instead hold true to their ideals. So deportations from the Channel Islands begin in earnest in 1942. 2,200 residents born outside of the islands were deported to Germany, where they were imprisoned, mostly imprisoned and forced to work in labor camps. Hitler hoped to use British citizens as some kind of hostages, and the Channel Islands were his direct supply. So British citizens who had remained without permanent residency in the islands were sent directly to German prisons. British men aged 16 through 70 and their families were also called to register for immediate deportation in September of 1942. In Saint-Hélier, a somber crowd gathered to see their deported neighbors off, and eyewitnesses recall that those gathered on the shore and those sailing away on the boat sang one last rendition of There'll Always Be an England, together in a moving display of community that stretched across the water. Later, French citizens were also summoned, including Cahun in 1944. This arrest rattled them, but they realized that there was no suspicion of their resistance activities at the time. With the help of their doctor, they played up their appearance as a sick old lady and were released after some questions about their origins, which they lied about. But others were not able to hide as effectively as Cahun. Jews on the islands without British citizenship were at greatest risk. There are records of at least 3 Jewish women, Polish-born Marianne Grenfeld and Austrian-born Therese Steiner and August Spitz, who were deported from Guernsey in 1942 and later murdered in Auschwitz. They were first sent to Saint-Malo in France, then to Drancy, a transit camp near Paris, before being deported to Auschwitz. Only 18 out of the 824 people on their specific transport survived. One of the most brutal parts of the Nazi occupation on the islands was the system of forced labor they imposed to build the Atlantic Wall fortifications. So not only were people being deported from the islands, but forced laborers were being brought in. The initial labor camp system was operated by the Nazi OT, the civil and paramilitary engineering organization that was well known for using POWs and other enslaved prisoners as forced labor. 4 labor camps were built on the island of Alderney alone, and you can see them marked on this map from a plaque commemorating those who were forced to labor on the islands. These camps had a reputation for the most brutal conditions. At least 1,000, though likely more, foreign people who were sent to the islands as forced laborers died during the occupation. About half of these were imprisoned Soviet citizens. The others included Czechs, Spaniards, Algerians, Dutch, and Belgians. You can see freed POWs posing for this photo on the left after liberation, with their uniforms reflecting the wide range of places that they came from. Additionally, between 800 to 2,000 imprisoned Jews, many French, were also sent to Alderney as forced labor, where they were treated particularly badly among this group. There were a small number of islanders who volunteered to work, and others, like Cahun's housekeeper's husband, worked for the hotels the Nazis stayed at. This was an everyday reality of the occupation, but Cahun and Moore were deeply troubled by the collaboration and accommodation they saw between the local population and the soldiers, even if under duress. Still, they also saw others around them resisting and helping prisoners in their own ways. So with all of this happening in the background, what are Cahun and Moore doing? What is this resistance activity that I keep referencing? The two wanted to find a way to fight back, but at first they struggled to agree. Cahun had chronic health issues and Moore worried about them. Furthermore, Moore worried that the plan was more about the glory of resisting rather than actually having an impact. But eventually, they agreed in partnership that something must be done, and they decided to use the tools already available to them and do it together. Cahun was interested in satire from World War I and hoped there might be a way to turn soldiers against the Nazi cause. Living in close proximity to the soldiers every day on the islands, they simply did not believe that all of the soldiers were dedicated Nazis. They thought these doubts might become big enough to hamper the occupation if soldiers felt that they were not alone. When reading some of these satires, Cahun came up with a phrase: victory, no; war, without end. They felt it would appeal to those soldiers who doubted their purpose. Ultimately, they decided that just the ominous "without end" appeared less like overt propaganda and began to scribble it on collected empty cigarette packets. Moore, the German speaker, translated the slogan. The two used different colors and handwriting styles to make it appear like many people were writing these notes. They then took a walk and began to drop these packets where they found them, and began adding the phrase to walls or other surfaces, covering Jersey with "on the end." They became bolder in these publications. This particular tract, which is preserved, reads in English, and here you'll see it in the top left. Hitler leads us, Goebbels speaks for us, Göring gorges himself on us, Ley drinks for us, Himmler murders for us, but nobody dies for us. These are Rowe's illustrations, and you can see some of the other tracts that they wrote depicted as well. Part of what is so amazing and unusual about this brand of resistance is that it required Cahun and Moore from the very beginning to see the soldiers as people, as individuals, who could be made to recognize their own individual roles and responsibility. By targeting their morale, they were also participating in an act of compassion toward their enemy. And in doing so, they combated both anti-German propaganda that depicted the German war machine as faceless, as well as German propaganda that showed that all soldiers were true loyal believers to the Nazi cause. At this point, Cahun and Moore's appearances as old eccentric ladies who walked their cat around on the island helped disguise them from suspicion as they made their distribution walks. But in their new project, they became a soldier with no name, a character they created meant to stand in for an immeasurable amount of disillusioned German soldiers. From their art careers and performances, they were used to taking on new characters. This would be no exception. Their work soon went beyond small graffiti and cigarette packets. In another action, they planted black crosses on gravestones in the nearby church that read, "For you, the war is over." Ominously, this was left on soldiers' remains. They hid tracts in the pages of German magazines and then redistributed them to other newsstands, hoping a soldier would pick them up unwittingly and come across the tract and assume that it had been another soldier who placed it inside the magazine. Their letters became more intricate and personal and made fun of specific Nazi higher-ups on the island, mocking the way that one Colonel Nakfus had a name that sounded like cracked feet in German. Using their hidden radio, they realized that the soldiers were receiving news a few days behind and started imbuing their tracts with what appeared to be prophetic insight into military events. This prodded the soldiers to realize they were being lied to. Many of the tracts were mocking and humorous. They were meant to attract attention with a laugh, but then provoke deeper questioning, just as Cahun has suggested a decade earlier in their writing on indirect action. Elsewhere on the islands, things were escalating. Food was ever scarcer among civilians, but the laborers fared the worst and were increasingly worked until they starved. But more and more islanders were fighting back in their own ways, and many were arrested for resistance activities as political prisoners. Some of these acts included sheltering prisoners who escaped from the labor camps on the islands, or providing them with extra food or packages to find on their marches to and from labor sites. Cahun and Moore participated in these acts as well, several times over. Cahun even tried to learn a little Russian to communicate with prisoners, only to find out in one exchange that a prisoner they snuck out a piece of cake to only spoke Ukrainian. They sheltered him in their home when he escaped for a number of weeks. And it was fairly common on the islands that prisoners who were perceived to be Russian actually turned out to be Ukrainian. By the end of the war, an additional 1,300 islanders had been imprisoned for acts of protest or defiance against the Nazis. So though Cahun and Moore mostly worked on their own on their specific campaign, they were not alone in resisting. At least 200 of these 1,300 were deported to continental Europe, and at least 28 of those deported died from conditions or were killed while imprisoned. Another set of resistors, siblings Louisa Gould and Harold Le Truinek, were arrested for sheltering an escaped Soviet prisoner for 18 months. They also had a sister who was arrested, but only faced a short amount of prison time on the island. Harold and Louisa were deported from Jersey in 1944. You can see plaques honoring them here. Harold was sent to Bergen-Belsen and was one of only 2 British survivors from that camp. Louisa was imprisoned 3 times in France before being deported to Ravensbrück, where she was murdered on February 13, 1945, only months before the camp was liberated. It's important to draw attention to these stories as well. They didn't have quite the same celebrity of Cahun and Moore because of their art profile, but there was a lot of resistance happening in a lot of different ways on the island, and for those that were rescued, like the Soviet prisoner, it did make a difference. He survived the war. In March 1943, Zilt and Norderney, 2 of the labor camps on Alderney, became concentration camps. They were the only Nazi concentration camps in British territory during World War II. They were administered as subcamps of the Neuengamme camp system in Hamburg. As you can see from the memorial plaque here, at least 400 were killed in Zilt alone during its final year as a concentration camp between March 1943 and June 1944. Reports from Norderney describe French Jews being kept in a separate section of the camp before being deported back to concentration or killing centers in continental Europe. When the camps were closed, German soldiers tried to cover over their evidence, and not much remains of them today. There's a small memorial where Zilt was, but Norderney is actually a recreational camping site. Finally, Cahun and Moore's own luck ran out on July 20th, 1944. The 2 had heard about the D-Day invasions that past June and felt the days of the war were numbered, but the Nazis continued to hunt and arrest political prisoners nonetheless. The plaque shown here is placed at a prison where many, including Cahun and Moore, were held. Though the soldiers had collected a huge dossier of the soldier with no name's tracts and notes, they did not yet connect them to Cahun and Moore until local vendors revealed their identities. Upon searching La Roque's, the Nazis discovered proof and arrested them. Cahun and Moore had planned for this inevitability and prepared lethal doses of sleeping pills. On the way to the prison, they took the pills together, but they only fell unconscious. The doses were not enough to kill either of them. After their recovery, they were kept apart in prison, much to their dismay. But this ordeal made them unfit for interrogation for a time, and it delayed the process of their arrest for a couple more weeks. They were kept alone during this time in damp, flea-ridden cells in isolation. Both attempted suicide again, believing the other was already dead, but both survived and they were kept on watch. All of this delayed their interrogation further. Friends were occasionally allowed to visit, and between these visits and help from other prisoners, they got a hold of banned writing implements and wrote some of their thoughts on toilet paper, which friends later smuggled out of the prison. Some of the other prisoners there with them were former German soldiers. One named Kurt Gunther indicated that he had seen Cahun and Moore's work as the soldier with no name before he deserted. There was a heartening amount of camaraderie amongst prisoners, as they all felt the war was nearing its end, and they were united in their political opposition of the Nazis. At some point, Cahun and Moore figured out how to smuggle letters to each other through vents in the walls, as other prisoners had done. They called this their postal system. Throughout the interrogations leading up to their trial, lawyers for both sides, both of whom were German appointed, since this was going to be mainly a show trial, they were frustrated by Cahun and Moore. They simply could not believe that these two, that they perceived to be weak old women, had carried off this campaign alone, and they could not understand why they would not recognize their own dire circumstances. Cahun and Moore remained resolute and offered no apologies throughout the process. They often made fun of the lawyers with whom they had an antagonistic relationship, to say the least. At last, they were brought up for trial on November 16, 1944. In the trial, they were called francs-tireurs, or guerrilla fighters, on par with those carrying out partisan operations on the continent. It was only during the trial that Cahun and Moore began to realize just how widespread an effect their work had on provoking soldiers to think and terrifying command. The judge declared that their crime was worse than picking up a weapon because they used spiritual arms, and so the full effect of their work could not be measured. In Rowe's recounting here, on the left, the text reads, quote, "With firearms, one knows at once what damage has been done, but with spiritual arms, one cannot tell how far-reaching it may be," unquote. This admission must have been immensely gratifying for Cahun and Moore. Though the two were sentenced to death, their execution was repeatedly delayed. The guards, who were fond of the couple, asked them to sign a plea of mercy to avoid being killed. They refused, but perhaps worried about the stir their execution might cause, on February 20th, 1945, the Germans commuted their sentence. This was the same week that Louisa Gould was murdered in Auschwitz for her similar resistance. Though not immediately freed from the prison, Cahun and Moore were elated that they could finally stay together in the same cell. Liberation finally came to Jersey on May 9th, 1945. The prisoners celebrated together and went out into the streets. This photo of celebrations unwittingly catches Cahun here in the crowd, just behind the soldier's elbow. It is possibly their fingers holding up the V for victory just to the right of their head. After the war, Cahun and Moore embraced life together again. But they struggled on Jersey, where others did not remember the war as they did. They tried to return to France, but ultimately felt it was no longer their home either. Cahun's health never fully recovered from their long imprisonment. They continued to write and produce art, but many of their belongings and prior work had been stolen by the Germans and could not be recovered. They renamed the sacked La Roque's a house with no name. Despite their suffering, the two had accomplished their goal. They wanted to stand up for those whose voices were taken from them, and that they had. Now they had time to be together again, and they returned to Jersey together. Cahun eventually grew sicker, and Moore cared for them until their death in 1954. They were buried at St. Prelades near their home. Moore continued to write about their resistance activities and imprisonment until her death in 1972. They are now buried together under twin stars of David. Cahun's tombstone is inscribed with the phrase, "And I saw new heavens and a new earth," a fitting nod to their passion for remaking the world in the face of great darkness. So today, there is much interest, especially in the last few years, growing interest across all different kinds of media in Cahun and Moore's stories. Exhibitions, podcasts, books, artwork, research across different disciplines is popping up everywhere. John Cameron Mitchell is even writing a play about their lives at the moment. So it's an exciting time to follow this work and to learn about this story. Cahun's art has been exhibited frequently in the US since at least the 90s and continues to show around the world. David Bowie even sponsored an exhibit of their work in 2007. There is a push more recently by scholars like Tirza True-Latimer to acknowledge that Cahun and Moore were artistic collaborators on many of the projects that have previously only been attributed to Cahun. This creates space for artists and others to find inspiration not just in their work itself, but in their deep partnership. Their love enabled their art as much as it allowed them to resist. Cahun wrote of being imprisoned, that being deprived of the sound of Moore's laugh was the greatest torture of the entire ordeal. So I want to leave you all with some of Cahun's own words reflecting on their and Moore's lives of resistance. This comes from an unpublished writing that was written sometime between 1948 and 51, and here I'm using Jennifer Shaw's translation. "I affirm that the right to resist and help others resist natural and social evils is the primary human right. Today, in even the most peaceful democracies, we are still dispossessed of these liberties, of these rights. I reclaim them. I affirm that to the degree to which each of us is free to live according to our own conscience, each of us is responsible for our own actions, responsible to ourselves and everyone else." Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Really, really interesting presentation. And I think that probably for most people, this is a story that they certainly did not know before. You mentioned that there's a lot of recent attention to their story. Was there any particular reason why right now that has sparked people's interest? Was there like an event that then these things snowballed from?
I don't know if there was a particular piece of media that maybe kicked this off, but certainly there are a lot of resonances between Cahun and Moore's story and the moment that we find ourselves in that are speaking to a lot of people. I think in the conversation I had at the beginning about pronouns, in addition, I think there's an embrace of Cahun's story within the trans community that are really uplifting this story and being able to talk about it in a new way in this moment that I think is drawing a lot of well-needed attention. And additionally, I mean, there are so many resistance stories where you kind of have to create or imagine what these things looked like. And there's some of that happening because Roe created this incredible graphic novel. But because Cahun and Moore are artists, this is almost like a pre-illustrated story. So there have also been some translations of their work into other languages, including English, and some compilations of their artwork alongside this story that I think make it really accessible to people in a way that sets it apart from some other resistance stories.
And is this interest both in the US and France and England? Is this kind of a widespread, or is it concentrated anywhere in particular?
I think that the US was a little bit later to recognizing Cahun and Moore's work than Europe. I think that if you are familiar with some of the surrealist figures that were really popular in Paris in that time, Cahun would kind of come up in those conversations. So their embrace in the US is also a little bit later, and that might be kind of why it's so strong at this moment in time.
And did you say early on that they were seeing gender and identity, they were talking about it as a performance?
Yes, absolutely.
Which is
And I would
so,
say
that seems very early, right?
very early. Yeah. I mean, some of their writings are really echo in this interesting precursory way, conversations that we didn't really start having until the 70s or later. So that's, I mean, really interesting. Again, they're not just artists, they're writers. So like the quote that I read at the end, we get really great insight into some of these discussions and explorations that they were having. Um, but yeah, Cahun was really thinking of kind of everything as a performance, but that included gender. And so it allowed them to be a part of that conversation to really bring that into surrealism in a way that it maybe wasn't the focus for other artists.
And so interesting, like you said, that that's usually something we think of in the 70s or later. Like that's a very Judith Butler thing to
Yeah,
say that gender is
exactly.
a performance, and then to have them saying it here, in this time period is really, really unique.
Yeah, I think that's another reason that the story in some ways feels so contemporary. Um, and though there are these kind of divides, the language that they would have used at the time is very different. But in some ways, we're kind of starting to think about the relationship between gender and sexuality again in a way that echoes some of the early conversations they were having. But of course, like coming at it from a much different angle and a really different understanding of queerness as well.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Additionally, your point too about how their ability to conceptualize, going against the grain, because both of these people had in some ways done that for years.
Mhm.
Could you talk a little bit more about that in terms of motivating their resistance?
Yeah, so I think when I was researching the story, when I heard about Ken's early idea of indirect action, it really illuminated for me that there was a through line. And people resist for all different kinds of reasons in all different ways. And there are a lot of stories of someone will spontaneously see something that spurs them to action. But part of the reason that Cahan and Moore were so successful is because they really had this consistent, sustained dedication to their resistance activities. And I think that a reason that that was possible for them, in addition to some of these structural advantages that I talked about, was because they had a whole ideology behind resistance developed before the Nazis even arrived. So they'd spent their entire lives kind of being the odd ones out and really experiencing what it felt like to be victimized for that in all of these different ways. And then they spent the 20s and 30s starting to think about the way that, victimization of different groups of people really hurts everyone. And they're able to carry that forward then when they're faced with it literally in their own backyard. And I think that they didn't really conceptualize themselves so much as like these highly at-risk figures during the occupation from the way that they continued to go out of their way to help imprisoned laborers and other people who they thought were actually in more danger than them. Just speaks to how like fully developed their idea of themselves as resistance figures already was.
Hmm. And you mentioned that they had a hard time after the war because of the people around them didn't have the same sort of memory of war. Could you kind of go into that a little bit? What was the main memory culture at the time?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the reasons that we maybe don't talk about the Channel Islands quite so much when we're talking about the Holocaust and even the Second World War. Um, there was a feeling amongst many islanders that the war is over, it's time to just forget about it and move on. And I think some of this was linked to a feeling of shame for those who didn't resist, or a reaction to the great trauma that people who had resisted and been imprisoned or otherwise victimized had suffered. But there was a general feeling that they needed to pick up and move forward. And Kahan and Moore, who kind of by nature being artists were more emotional, self-reflective kind of figures weren't ready to do that. Their imprisonment had a really profound effect on them. In addition to their multiple suicide attempts, right? They spent a period of this time thinking that each other had died and that they were going to have to live without the other, which is, I mean, a very moving experience. So they weren't ready to just put it all behind them. And they had nothing to be ashamed about. They had fought back to the best of their ability. So they wanted that kind of political community from the 20s and 30s to be around them again, and it just wasn't there for them in Jersey.
Hmm. And yeah, such an interesting divide when you see how, you know, people who had similar experiences, but in some ways how they choose to move on and what they're capable of doing afterwards is very different.
Yeah.
I thought the point about spiritual resistance, that the like judge makes, that is more dangerous because you can't actually measure the impact or the damage. Ultimately, what do you think their actions can teach us about resistance?
I mean, there's so much. And again, I really recommend that everyone goes and reads Liberated or some of these other sources, because this is just a small glimpse into everything that they did. But I think there's a couple different ways. I mean, one of the things is you have to work with what you have. So Cahun and Moore wouldn't have been particularly effective guerrilla fighters if they had access to weapons. But they used their minds and their history as artists to really build something powerful. And I think that's the other lesson, is that making these little choices along the way to resist and to push back can have really big effects down the line. So they chose not to register, which meant that they were then flying under the radar, which meant that they could then hold on to their typewriter, hold on to their radio, and these things enabled their resistance to be much more effective down the line. So I think they really show us a model for this like sustained commitment that doesn't always in the moment feel like it's doing a lot, but actually in the future might give you an opportunity to really help someone.
Because we like to think of resistance as one big action rather than
Right.
a series of sustained choices that takes a long time to cumulatively have the impact that we ultimately want to have.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for this. Thanks to everyone who was joining us. This was really interesting. And again, another story that we should look into more because it has real resonance for us. So thank you all and have a good evening.
Thank you.